Hey everybody, welcome back to Why Is This a Podcast? Before I start, the eagle-eyed among you will have noticed the slight differences in my set. Uh, there's a bookshelf behind me, the objective of which is to make me seem intelligent. So, yeah, I hope that works. Also, coming to you now after we've had 100,000 deaths in the UK, which is a tragedy. Um, and so before I get into the interview with my guest tonight, um, is just something I felt compelled to acknowledge because 100,000 is a statistic, but with every 100,000 there's a death, leaving behind loved ones, and my condolences. I try and be funny on this show sometimes. I want to be funny. I don't know how often I succeed. It's hard to even try to be funny when you're facing the fact that 100,000 plus people in your own country have died, of which the vast majority were most probably preventable. And we're all suffering. And it does make me sort of grateful for the fact that the biggest inconvenience of my week was the fact that I had to change my desk around. To those of you who've lost loved ones to COVID-19, I hope that you're okay as much as you can be. I offer you my love. I offer you my prayers. And I hope that no more needless deaths will happen. They very well may be. Ultimately, we're in this together. And I'm with you. As I said, I give you my love. Now, COVID-19, one of the things about it is the fact that none of the issues of COVID-19, or at least most of the issues, they're not new issues. They're issues that we had before. And one of the issues that we had and continue to have are the experiences of people with mental health issues and addiction issues, where COVID-19 has certainly underscored them. And I wanted to talk, and I've been looking forward to this interview for quite some time, to a writer, speaker, and mental health advocate who has been very, very vocal about addiction issues and mental health issues throughout the pandemic and before. Joins me now. It's Mr. Sam Thomas. Hello, Sam.
Hello,
Thanks so much for being here.
it's my pleasure.
I, I follow you on Twitter, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
That's how we got in touch. Almost to the point of stalking in some respects. Um, how are you coping? Are you okay with
Um, well, I think I'm coping surprisingly well with the lockdown number three, and hopefully not counting. But no, I think the past few days, I think the reality of lockdown has sort of kicked in that we're going to be in this a little bit longer just yet. So I suppose you could call it lockdown fatigue. Probably the best way to describe it, really. But I'm probably coping far better than I give myself credit for. Put it that way.
because you're obviously very very vocal about on Twitter
Mm,
about your journey with recovery
yeah.
and your journey with sobriety, which as we've touched on in our pre-interview chat,
Mm,
um, you know, it's difficult. It's ridiculously difficult.
mm.
for addicts, for alcohol addicts, during lockdown, because you're spending so much more time indoors and you're not going out and you're not you're seeing people, and you're gonna try and comfort, and people will be like, get on with it. And I myself, people who know me intimately, people who know me well, know that I've got my own issues, my own experiences with addiction and mental health. It can be frustrating to explain to people. So I want to go to you on this. My first question. It's on a piece of paper, so it's official. What do people, in your estimation, what do they misunderstand about addiction?
Well, I think firstly, addiction is a spectrum. I think it's probably safe to say, and it's a very wide-ranging spectrum that, is very individual to each and every person. I think it's safe to say. I think, when I talk about addiction, just from my own experience, it's not just the psychological addiction to alcohol; it was also the physical. And of course, I think a lot of people might not necessarily understand what that is and what the difference is. And I suppose, with me, if I'm going to start back, rewind the tape, go back to the beginning of my sort of story, probably the most simplest and easiest way of describing it is almost like an invisible line that you cross. So obviously, by default being invisible, you're not aware that you cross with addiction. So therefore, you're sort of functioning and coping and managing alcohol, drinking on a very regular basis, i.e. daily, and throughout the day. So I think that's very much summarizes my sort of understanding, if you like, of addiction in terms of its sort of definition. But of course, it is very multifaceted, it is complex, it's hardwired, it's all those things. So it is very individual to each and every person. And it's something that I'm still getting my head around. And I don't think I'll ever have a concrete sort of firm sort of understanding of what an addiction is, because that can change day to day. I think with my understanding, the more I learn, the more that I've reflected on my experiences, and the more sort of join up the dots and make up those, make those connections.
One of the things that strikes me about the conversation that people have about alcohol is that and I don't know how superficial or facile this is, but it's like when you're going on holiday in the beautiful times before the pandemic, you going on holiday.
I remember.
And like, you'd be in the airport. You'd be at the airport at like say 6-7 o'clock. And there's no stigma there to someone having a pint or whatever at that time in the morning before you go on holiday and you get on the plane. But when because you're just enjoying yourself. But when somebody's actually physically dependent on alcohol, and like to go through alcohol withdrawal without medical supervision, there is a chance that you could, you become very, very sick, die. Like you see somebody drinking whatever time in the morning, so that doesn't happen. Then there's that stigma there. One of your tweets that I love, where you say, if you have to have a glass of wine at 8:30 in the morning as your breakfast to avoid withdrawal, have it. Don't worry about what people think. Have that glass of wine if you need it, if you need that for your health, which I know for many people who don't understand is why I think I'm doing this interview. One of many reasons why I'm doing this interview. I've always wanted to talk to you, but it's your health. You can't recover if you're going to be sick and die.
Exactly. Well, I think that's all the things that you've just described are things that I've been through, essentially. I remember sitting in the airport, at 6 o'clock in the morning, drinking wine, which was very much near normal to me. And I think, just being in the airport whilst everyone else was doing it was sort of the sort of reinforcement that this was socially acceptable in my sort of universe, as it were. So, it's kind of, I do remember those days and I don't miss those days. And I think the most important point, just following on from everything you've said about withdrawal, I think, unfortunately, a lot of people who are alcohol dependent or addicted, will not realize that they have a problem until they try to stop. And more often than not, several times over. And then they realize they fall down very unwell, physical symptoms as well as psychological symptoms that are just very much unexplained. And that was very much my experience. It was actually on the third time I'd sort of had one of these major sort of episodes in a 6-month period. I'd gone to A&E, and that's when they sort of diagnosed me as alcohol dependent, and I didn't know at all whatsoever what alcohol withdrawal meant, let alone what alcohol dependency meant. And of course, you've got to be dependent to have withdrawal. And of course, when they explained to me that I've got to sort of drink to prevent these symptoms, it's the most absurd sort of medical advice in all history of medical advice. It just sounds like the complete opposite of what you're meant to be told, to keep drinking. You think of all the campaigns where we're being warned about sort of watching our drinking, but when you're alcohol dependent, it's the other way around. You've got to keep drinking to prevent, these very serious episodes of withdrawal. And I suppose this is to raise, what is withdrawal? And, when I have these very normal sort of conversations with people that don't necessarily understand, withdrawal is very serious. It's in its worst can be life-threatening, and it's not just simply having the shakes or the sweats or fever-like symptoms. It can be very extreme symptoms, such as psychosis, which I had experienced. Very mild, sort of extreme episodes of where you're seeing things that are not there. Like shapes and creatures in particular that sort of try to attack you in your sleep. And I know it sounds quite bizarre on the face of it, but this can, for some people, be a very real sort of reality of what they experience during withdrawal. And because I had a history of eating disorders as well as alcohol dependency, my body was very malnutritioned, so I just happened to be one of the people that was very high risk of very serious sort of withdrawal episodes, which of course, to overcome those withdrawal episodes and ultimately the alcohol dependency, it does require detox, which I did several times over.
It is the fact that for addiction, I suppose, someone who's there myself, in many respects, addiction, it's not a one-off.
No,
it could be one after the other. It could be like giving up alcohol, giving up whatever you're addicted to. There's the chance there that you were going to be back in that doctor's waiting room time and time again for a referral to a counselling service, and that doesn't take away from your from the success you've had in the past. It doesn't take away from that. Every time you do it, you could if there are any children watching, cover your ears, but you fuck up once, you can get better again. You can fuck up again, get better again. It's not a binary process. It's not a process of it has to be one or the other. It has to be I get better, and then I never relapse again, and then I'm a complete failure if I do relapse. It's not that. So, which is why I think your messaging on social media is important, because there's the authenticity there. There's the realism there. There's no varnish on what you communicate. There's nothing there that's superficial, or it's very blunt. It's very direct.
Yeah.
I'm not just blowing smoke up your ass, by the way. I do genuinely believe it. But what I wanted to ask you on that is, why is it important for you to speak up on it and your own experience and bring that into it? Because there's a lot of people who go through this, who like, they just say, that's my past.
Yeah.
That's my past. I don't want anything more to do with it. You know, throw that in the bin. I just want to move forward and I don't want to talk about it. Why is it important for you, Sam, to talk about it so openly and so publicly as you do?
Well, I think I realised from, I detoxed several times. I think it's 4 times in total, and I relapsed sort of fairly quickly the first time, and the second time, I had about 4 months of sobriety, which was actually 2 summers ago. But the interesting thing about that was that I did that very quietly, without the support really that was necessarily available to a lot of people like AA or SMART and lots of the different recovery programs. I never went to rehab in the end, so I had to sort of invent things for myself, I suppose. Using things that I'd read online and things that I'd learned from other people, just a small number of people that I was speaking to at that time with issues around addiction. But on reflection of that period, of sobriety the first time around, I kind of concluded that um, recovery doesn't work in isolation. And I think that was the big thing for me, that actually, in my work, over the years, I've worked in eating disorders, specifically eating disorders in men. I ran a charity for 10 years. And of course, I was very vocal about my experiences of having had bulimia, which is kind of like another addiction, I suppose. And so it kind of felt, if I'm very vocal about eating disorders in men, there should be no difference why I shouldn't be vocal about this. And in fact, in some ways, I think it was more important to be more vocal about addiction, not just for simply keeping me on the right track, but also to help others to keep them, through my tweets, for instance, showing my experiences and what I've learned from those experiences.
Because there's certainly a lot of people, because we were having the conversation about dependency, there's certainly a lot of people who are like, oh, well, maybe I drink too much, so I'll just stop and go cold turkey, and then they don't realize that that's life threatening for them. They don't. I didn't know that. In my own experience, I didn't know that. So like, maybe seeing like one of your tweets about it, or anyone similarly advocating for mental health or people with addiction issues, seeing that could actually save someo's life.
Absolutely, that's the point I was building up to. I suppose one of the reasons why I do
sorry, I preempted you.
No, it's good. It's a good point, because you reminded me of a couple of things there. But I think one of the reasons why I kind of do the tweets, for instance, and the occasional blog and everything out, and radio interviews and all different things that I do, is because I know there are people out there exactly in the same boat that I was, very much in this current time, particularly during the pandemic and during these periods of lockdown, because of course, that does force this isolation sort of scenario into a lot of people. So it's kind of the ideal sort of pressure cooker, I suppose, for addictions to sort of manifest, not just for those with a history of addictions, but perhaps for people who are sort of finding themselves in the sort of, in the grips of alcohol addiction for the first time. So, and there probably will be a lot more people, needing that sort of treatment and support after, beyond the pandemic, once things eventually return to sort of near normal. So I do think, a lot of it is kind of like, I suppose, a way of sort of speaking to people who are in the position that I was like 2, 3, 4 years ago, when I was just suddenly found myself stumbling into this world of alcohol dependency, not really understanding how on earth I got there. So it is, a lot of the things that are, very important to know, like, not go cold turkey, for instance, which of course is the number one rule. But, a lot of people think I'm not that bad, so therefore that doesn't really concern me. That isn't the category of dependency that they fall under. But of course, if they're functioning and managing and coping, then of course they're going to think that they haven't got a problem. So I think it's just my way of sort of educating people and hopefully enabling people to get the support when they are ready to.
It certainly helps me, I'll be honest with you, yeah. And I'll be honest with people watching, helps me. Helps me knowing this. You know, from your tweets, from various different people whose life experiences um, involves alcohol addiction. It is helpful because you can hear it from a doctor all you like. You can hear it from a nurse all you like. When you hear it from somebody, say, well, I was drinking this much, I was taking this amount of drugs, etc., and it made me feel ill. And I think it's at that point in somebody's recovery journey. Is it the sobriety or recovery posse?
Recovery Posse.
When you hear from people in the recovery posse, and you see like the stories, the examples that you relate to, I think that there's a massive impetus there for somebody to embark on their own recovery journey and be part of the recovery posse. Whereas, like as you said, a lot of people, they'll just think, "Oh, I'm fine, I'm good, I don't drink that much."
Everyone starts off fine.
Exactly. It's like it's a thin line. I think it's one of the thinnest lines you can cross. It's one of your tweets I've got wrote down here, where you write, one of the problems with alcohol addiction is there's an invisible line people are unaware that they've crossed. They believe they're fine, their drinking is under control. Only when they try to stop do they discover they've crossed that invisible line. Absolutely. Which is why I think, what you do is so great. Again, I'm not blowing smoke up your ass, I promise you.
No, but I think it's worth, we've mentioned the Recovery Posse, and I suppose it's good for anybody who's watching this and listening that, the Recovery Posse is a group of people, all with experience with addictions, but mental health issues and a life, I suppose, that, that come together to sort of share their experiences and also to sort of support one another, really, ultimately. And of course, recovery works in numbers. This idea that it's going back to the whole isolation scenario, it's the opposite to that. The idea that by just very informally sort of keeping connected on Twitter, for instance, sort of it's that extra support that they may need that they might not be able to get within their immediate sort of circle in everyday sort of real life, as it were. So, and the great thing about the Recovery Posse being on Twitter is that it's 24/7. You can access it any time, and of course, there's people all around the world, quite literally. So, you kind of feel like you're, part of a much bigger sort of movement, if you like, in terms of, that whole recovery and yeah, not just for yourself, but sort of in numbers, as I say. So I think it's a huge, and particularly at the moment with the lockdowns, it feels like it's never ending. You know what I mean? It's even more sort of, timely and relevant to sort of be able to use these different ways of accessing support, like the Recovery Posse.
An addiction, of course, it's a very very lonely place. It's a very lonely place, and so the recovery phase, I suppose, it dies on it not being lonely. It lives, dies on support and the posse, as you say, and everybody can have their own posse, I suppose.
Yeah.
I've always been averse to group therapy because I'm a miserable bastard and I'm very, very grumpy. But for addiction, it's the only time I ever really consider group therapy, because I do think there is an argument to be had for talking to people who are, who have hit the rock bottom. Maybe not even once, maybe more than once, maybe so many times. You mentioned earlier about eating disorder, and if you're comfortable, I'd like to just discuss that. Because you mentioned obviously eating disorders, and eating disorders is generally thought of as a women's problem.
Yeah.
When it affects both sexes, it affects, anybody could develop. Yeah. Similarly to my first question, what do people get wrong about eating disorders?
Well, firstly, I think they think it's all about food, which it's not necessarily. Eating disorders, like addiction, is complex. It's very sort of individual again. But I think the thing that is most important about eating disorders is that I think a lot of people may not necessarily realise it is a psychological sort of disorder, mental health problem first and foremost, and it has this sort of behaviours attached to it that are very much the physical behaviours. So it can range obviously from food and eating, but also exercise as well. And eating disorders, it can be a trauma response. It can be linked to all sorts of other mental health issues like obsessive compulsive disorder. It can be linked to sort of borderline personality disorder and PTSD and complex PTSD. The list goes on. So it kind of fits within these other sort of mental health problems, generally speaking, as does addiction. Obviously it's very well documented that addiction and trauma sort of come hand in hand a lot of the time. Eating disorders is no different. So there are a lot of similarities and sort of parallels really between eating disorders and addiction. Now, the interesting thing with me, my eating disorder began when I was 13, so I was extremely young. And it was actually as a response to the bullying that I was enduring at school. Now, at the time, I was horrendously bullied at every opportunity, it seemed, and a lot of the bullying was very much centric around this idea that I could be gay. Now, at that age, I had no idea what my sexuality was. I didn't understand what gay as a term, what the definition was for that. It was very much a totally different time period 20 years ago to as it is now. So understanding around a lot of things were still sort of in their sort of infancy, like sexuality, and we weren't discussing those issues back then. So my way of dealing with the bullying was to hide in the boys' toilets because it was the only place where I would be found. And it was there where I used to binge and purge on the contents of my lunchbox. Now, I don't really particularly remember those days that much now, being 35, but what I do remember is that, again, it's come back to that invisible line scenario where it started off with binging, but then it became binging and purging, as I just mentioned. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was something that I'd invented. I didn't think it was something that,
there was a response.
Was it a disease or, it was very serious, what the health impacts of that might be. And like the word gay, I didn't really know the word bulimia either. So, I was very much living in a sort of in a little bubble, I suppose. And to cut a very long story short, I actually realised I had bulimia when I actually read an agony aunt column in one of my mum's magazines, believe it or not. And there was a letter from a mother who's recently split from her partner, and when she put the kids to bed at night, she used to binge and purge. Now, obviously, I didn't relate with her situation, but I certainly related with the behaviours, and that's how I came to learn about bulimia. And when I attempted to get help at 16 and again at 18, to no avail at all whatsoever, I didn't get the help that I needed. And I think reflecting on those experiences, I kind of realised it was probably because, I was a man. And that was in very early 2000s. So we weren't really talking about anorexia then bulimia. So there were a lot of hurdles to overcome. But of course, when I eventually did sort of overcome sort of bulimia, which the only way I can describe it now is a series of suddenly this happened, suddenly that happened, and then the bulimia sort of became redundant. But of course, over the course of my 20s, that's when alcohol crept in, because I actually didn't drink at all until I was very early 24. So I went from being completely sober in the beginning of my 20s to sort of full-blown alcohol dependent by the end of my 30s, requiring detox. So I think we mentioned this earlier, this whole idea of switching, one replaces the other. You can deal with one thing, but it finds its ugly way of sort of manifesting it in a totally different way. And I guess now being 35, I've noticed that sort of pattern times two with bulimia and alcohol dependency. So now being aware of it, I know there is always that potential for other things to sort of manifest. So, the only way to deal with that is dealing with the underlying traumas, really, that sort of led me down that path in the first place. And I've got a lot of baggage. I've got a lot of a big backlog of different issues over the years that, and I've always said that trauma has this funny old way of leading to other traumas if it remains unresolved. So that in a nutshell is where I'm at now. And I suppose just sort of summarizes that link between bulimia to alcohol.
The one thing I was told before, which I think is apt, is that something becomes an addiction at the point where it's like a bookmark between chapters of your normal life. I think that so it basically, it's the bookmark at first, and then your normal life, as much as that is, however you describe as normal, at the point that the bookmark becomes your normal life, and the chapters are then the addiction. So that transition. But I mean, it is in my case. I think it's the case of most people that addiction, whatever it's to, various disorders, if not all of them, perhaps, or at least most of them, it is a response to trauma. And I didn't appreciate that, because when I sort of, it's similarly to you, my experience with depression began around about the same age as you identified. I was about 13, I think, when I started to display symptoms of depression. And it was just this thing of, like, at the time, you're trying to rationalize something that can't be rationalized, because you think, well, I'm sad, but why am I sad?
Yeah.
Why am I miserable? Why do I feel alone? And and I looked for reasons. I almost tried to invent reasons why. And ultimately, it was just that it's depression. It's there. It's part of my psyche. It's part of who I am. I had experiences with bullying. I had experiences with various issues at that time, but it wasn't the cause of my depression. And that then fed into addiction for me. And I think it's a kind of a similar experience to you. I don't think I realized that I had a drinking problem. I know that you mentioned about the agony aunt column in terms of an eating disorder. I don't think I realized that I had a drinking problem until I read. It wasn't an agony aunt column, but I was reading. It was an essay someone wrote about alcohol, where they described their first drink, which is what teenagers do. You go out, you drink in private, you drink in secret. Don't want your parents to find out, so you find like a sort of a, if you're from somewhere rural like I am, you find a bit in the hills somewhere. And he said, I kind of came to the conclusion that I had a drinking problem, where I reflected on the first time I had a drink and got drunk with like my friends or whatever. And when I realized I couldn't remember the last time that I got drunk and couldn't, and you know, sort of garbling my words because obviously it's personal. Because I realized at one point I couldn't remember the last time I got drunk
Mm.
and could remember what happened when I was drunk.
Mm.
The blackout drinking. He said I couldn't remember the last time that didn't happen. And it's very, I think it's sim. I don't know if I'm just drawing parallels that maybe are unfair or something, but
No, and I think, it's interesting because I didn't really experience blackouts till quite much later on after I detoxed and after I'd relapsed. Actually, it was quite weird because I was functioning perfectly well, as it were, for a long while until I stopped, as I said earlier, several times over. And of course, all that was very unexplained, what I was experiencing in terms of those symptoms. But, later on, after I'd relapsed, to where, I was in full blown sort of, I was going to say full blown rebellion mode, I suppose. But do you know what I mean? I think I was in some ways sort of quite angry about the things that had happened to me in the past and the way I was treated, particularly even in those very early days, I think, of when I was very open to all the people that I was working with, for instance, and family about my drinking. And all of a sudden, their attitude towards me did change. You know what I mean? Well, it's perfectly well to talk to me, and respect me for my bulimia, but not for the alcohol issue. And I found that quite bizarre. What's the difference? It's the same issue manifested in different ways, presented in different ways. I suppose, when I was in full blown rebellion mode after I'd relapsed, yeah, I was experiencing blackouts, and I was suicidal, to be quite frank. So, I had didn't care really of what happened to me. And in fact, it would have been quite convenient if I did sort of accidentally kill myself. But that was the headspace I was in at that time. And, but the point I was going to make is the fact that in a way it's kind of all very much driven by trauma the whole time, and I didn't necessarily think of it as trauma because these were everyday situations that were happening. And it was kind of sort of adding salt over that open wound, really, of the original sort of issues that led me down that path in the first place. A very significant issue, happened to me in adulthood that, led to more sort of regular, sort of more extreme sort of drinking, I suppose.
I think
So
like
that was just, just that was enough to sort of send me over the edge, really.
I like the fact that you used the term rebellion
Mm.
because rebellion always infers anger. It always suggests anger. And I do think that anger goes hand in hand with addiction, with trauma, with mental health issues. Because I mean, I don't know. In my experience, I suppose, in my experience, I don't want to speak for anyone else. You do get days where you're like, my trauma isn't my fault.
Mm-hmm.
My depression isn't my fault. My mental health issues aren't my fault. These are just things that I'm stuck with.
Mm.
At worst, these are things that people have stuck me with.
Yeah.
And, the addiction comes from that. And as you say, you say to people, they'll be understanding maybe about one issue, not about addiction.
Yeah.
And so, that does kind of sometimes, I think, perhaps predispose someone to maybe say, well, if nobody wants to have like an honest conversation about what this is and where this comes from, I may as well go all in.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, that feeds in, I think, to a broader conversation about the community and about families,
Mm.
loved ones of people who go through addiction. Because I know for a fact it's very hard to love somebody who's an addict.
Mm.
And was that an issue for you?
Oh yes, definitely. I think, I think a lot of, without question, I think, it sort of just killed off a lot of relationships, really, and certainly at the very least sort of made them feel more distant. So without question, I think even now, I kind of still feel the legacy, if you like, of those relationships that are very much been damaged by the issues that I was going through. But I think, again, even though I do take responsibility for that now through my recovery, I don't take, I try not to sort of take the responsibility for how other people sort of are impacted by my drinking, because often, more often than not, it's not really just the drinking and the issues that were happening at that time that they're dealing with. It could sort of be a whole bunch of different things that may have very little to do with me, if that makes any sense. So I think, it's one of those where I think I've had to sort of learn the hard way to sort of not sort of take things personally in that respect, I guess.
So it's like striking the balancing act between holding yourself accountable,
Yeah.
not assuming the world's problems on your shoulders.
But also, it's very easy to blame the alcoholic for a lot of things. This is the other thing that I had experienced. You almost become, a bit of a target in some respects, for some people who don't take responsibility for certain things in their lives. So they'll try to blame someone else. And I definitely experienced a bit of that as well. So I think, it is about balance, and it is about sort of kind of just being realistic, I suppose. And I guess, through the personal development work that I'm doing, and therapy and things like that, I'm able to explore some of these sort of issues and those relationships and that legacy, as I say.
I think to a certain point, I imagine it's about, again, this may just be me. I think to a certain point, somebody with mental health issues or addiction issues or both, as you rightly identified, they go hand in hand so much of the time. I think it's about assuming and embracing your own humanity, not sort of seeing yourself as some kind of other.
Yeah.
That the addict is not the man you once, you used to be somebody different. Now you're somebody different, but you're still the same. Your humanity is unchanged. I mean, I hope that makes sense to people watching. I hope that makes sense to you.
Makes sense to me.
But it is about sort of embracing your fallibility. I make mistakes. I'll make mistakes if I'm drunk. I'll make mistakes if I'm sober, and I'll make, either way, I'll assume responsibility for that. But it has to be in the broader context of communities, families, relationships. It has to be like that, I suppose. I hope that makes sense.
It does. Actually, it certainly does to me, because I
I'm
think
glad it makes sense to you. It doesn't make sense to me as it came out of my mouth. But
I think, like, I kind of, just building on what I was saying previously, I think sometimes you can almost have this scenario where somebody's in recovery from addiction and takes on far too much responsibility to make up for all the responsibility others around them are not sort of addressing. Do you see what I mean? So that's where you do get that imbalance. And I think, it is a journey of self-discovery. It's about finding yourself. It's about evolution. Sobriety is about all those things. If it was only begins and ends with not drinking, it would be easy. We'd all be doing it. So I think
there's so much more along the way.
Absolutely, and I think that's what I probably massively underestimated at the beginning. And but these days, sort of find quite interesting, quite motivating, and not just to keep me on track, but just because those are the issues that I'm interested in at grand old age of 35, and hopefully being older and wiser and all that. So it is it can really be the beginning of life, if you like, being sober.
Before I let you go, I want to just ask you one last thing. Is you're writing a book?
Yes.
And what kind of host would I be if I didn't let you talk about the book? I do want to ask about the book in all seriousness. What can you tell myself, the people watching, and about the book, and to what extent does writing it factor into your recovery process?
Well, it's interesting. So I decided to write the book before I was recovered, if I to be honest. So I kind of got things slightly the wrong way around. but I guess in some ways it was the motivation to sort of, you know, for my recovery. You know, one supports the other. You know, the book supports my recovery, and the recovery supports the book, because the book is about recovery.
Yeah.
And you know, and I remember sort of being in detox for the fourth and hopefully final time in hospital 2 Novembers ago. And I came up with a title, which I won't say just yet. And I kind of thought, oh, you know, I will do this book, and that's what I've been working on ever since.
Mm-hmm.
Not sort of relentlessly, but just sort of, you know, burst at a time, if you like. And
You chip away a bit.
yeah, kind of, yeah, you know, and just sort of really just sort of thinking about it before I write it as well. You know, having that thinking time and planning it, and then doing the writing. So that's why, you know, I'm taking time with it. But also, it's partly, you know, to address some of the more wider issues as well as the drinking. You know, understanding that, you know, drinking is very rarely the issue. It's often the surface problem, if you like, of a whole bunch of a whole load of things. And that, in a nutshell, is about what the book is about. And yeah, I kind of don't want to say too much about it just yet. But yeah, but it's 2 thirds written, and I'm hoping it will be published in the next couple of years. I think is probably the safe answer.
I look forward to the book. I look forward to reading it. I mean, if I were you personally, I would just create a book of tweets of you know.
Well,
If I wrote tweets as good as yours, I would just create a book of tweets, and then
well, I'm doing a second book after the first, and I think it's kind of the tweets, but in a book, if you like.
can I call that an exclusive?
You can actually, yes. I don't think I
Exclusive.
Okay.
James, my editor, you Mark Thursday, he won't do it. He won't do it.
And I thought the title for the second book as well. So if I've got the title, I can think about writing it. I always get stuck. If I don't have a title, I can't really think beyond that.
In all seriousness, obvious, you know, because I try, you know, part of this is part of my recovery process. Is why I was so keen to talk to you. Yeah, I mean, there's something about starting something during recovery.
Yeah.
Where I think it's something that people miss about addiction, is that they think you're in control 100%, and you're in control to a certain point. I think you're in control to a certain point, but to a certain point you're not. As we were talking about alcohol dependency, I think there's something about throwing yourself into something creative that allows you to take ownership. And I think that's why that's how I feel about, you know, because I've been trying to write, I've been doing this show with people. There's something about throwing yourself into something that isn't what you're trying to leave behind.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's what I've always done. You know, I think on the back of my recovery from bulimia, you know, I set up a charity, and that was very much in the early days. And it's like history repeats itself, I suppose. You know, with this, you know, it's the books, and so I think there is something about sort of doing that fairly early on in your recovery, sort of having something to commit to that supports your recovery. You know, can't be a bad thing. I think it's safe to say, and you know, and it's, I think for me, you know, it's always about, you know, not leaving the past behind. It's sort of, you know, acknowledging the past, but carrying the learning with you. And, you know, I've always had that sense in everything I've done over the years of having no shame in what I've experienced, but also having ownership over it. And I suppose if that sort of describes anything about my recovery, I think it's exactly that: no shame and taking ownership. So, you know, yeah, I think it's very important to me.
That was a much better point than the one I made. That's why you're the guest. It's my number one rule of interviewer: always assume that the guest knows more than you do. Sam, it's been absolutely lovely to talk to you. Thank you for being so honest about such personal topics, and thank you for your advocacy
Thank you.
and your candor. It's not lost on me. I hope it won't be lost on anybody who watches this, how difficult it can be to talk about these issues. But I appreciate your time today, and everything you're doing to make sure that people are getting the right messages. Best of luck with the book, and give my love to the posse.
Thank you.
From Why Is This a Podcast? My name is Kieran Watts. I'm your host. Before I go, just say thank you to James, Jack, my wonderful team. Happy New Year's, guys, and thanks for everything you're doing. Join us on our next episode. I'll be speaking to my friend Josh Owen Craig. Join us, won't you? Stay safe, stay healthy, stay well, stay informed, stay engaged.